Chapter 41 Gathering of Owls. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Evelyn, having made her decision to at least look into this owl's roost, turned her head towards the direction she had been pointed in. She was still not certain whether she should be trusting that other owl, but the possibility of entering a society of owls was too tempting. If it were to be true, she would be able to gain a safe place to live and would likely be able to learn all manner of knowledge that she was unable to pick up from just the books Mason had left to her. They may have even developed some spells that I can use. That way I will be able to do more than just creating basic magical phenomenon. With the pros outweighing the cons, Evelyn leapt out of the tree she had been sleeping in and took off towards where the gathering of owls was supposed to be. Though this time she was less brazen about flying around and moved stealthy from tree to tree. She did not want to get ambushed by any more eagles or other beasts for that matter. So, even while she moved much slower, it was worth it not to risk her life. Along the way she did actually spot another group of eagles that were in the middle of fighting it out with a high-tier fiend beast-ranked owl. Unfortunately, this owl stood little chance of winning in a 3-on-1 fight, and it would not be long until it was killed. And unlike the owl that had intervened in her battle, Evelyn had no such acts of heroics in her. Her life was the most important thing for her, and she was not going to get into any battles that did not gain her something, especially one as risky as this. Sorry, it is every owl for themselves as far as I am concerned. Continuing on, she did not stay to watch the fate of this other owl, though she figured it was likely to not be pretty. Still, it did give her more evidence that the snowy owl had been telling the truth about what was happening. Continuing deeper into the jungle, she began to spot other owls more frequently, and some of them spotted her. A couple even came over and tried to attack her, but found that while her power may have seemed lower than them, she was more dangerous than they imagined. Even a peak fiend beast felt some fear from her when it got too close and suddenly felt nearly 4 times heavier. Entering a field of gravity that was that much stronger was uncomfortable for pretty much any creature, so it quickly backed off when it realized that Evelyn was a threat. This happened a number of times as she continued forward, now having entered into an area that was dense with owls heading to the same place. The stronger owls, most of which were at the peak of the fiend beast rank, would bully the weaker owls until they gave up and left, or in many cases were killed. However, there was risk involved with this, as some antagonistic owls got the tables turned on them and ended up horribly injured or dead instead. Even though they were all owls, this was still the wilds, and the rule of strength was absolute. Only those with the power to make it to the meeting place of the owls had a chance to enter what Evelyn did not know right now, was quite the powerful society. They had no need for the weak, so only the strong could enter the ranks of the owl's roost. Soon she came to an area of the jungle that was covered by a thick blanket of dense fog that she could barely see 10 feet into even with her amazing vision as an owl. Though while she stopped and floated at the edge of his barrier of fog, a number of owls plunged in without any hesitation. That one was an awakened beast. Looking at the other owls heading into the fog, Evelyn caught sight of one of them that gave off a much more powerful presence, and there was no doubt it had evolved past the fiend beast rank. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself and took the plunge into the fog. Once inside, she felt the magical energy flowing through this fog, and there was no doubt it was not a natural phenomenon. Still, as she advanced, she wondered what kind of magic would be powerful enough to create something like this. Deeper and deeper into the fog she went, flying very slowly to avoid smashing headfirst into a tree. To make matters worse, this area had become much denser with foliage, and the trees had sharp branches jutting out of them. At one point Evelyn even saw an owl that had pierced one of its wings on these sharp branches, and it was likely to die from this, or at the least have to give up on joining the owl's roost. Stopping and starting while repositioning herself, many times she ran into an impassable wall of trees and vines and had to change directions. This place was like a maze, and the fact that she could only see around 10 feet in front of her did not help. Hours went by as she was lost in the fog and had been turned around so many times, she was not really sure which direction she was going anymore. She had tired using her wind magic to blow the fog away, but it resisted her, and at best she gained herself a few more feet of visibility temporarily until the fog quickly rolled back in. Going around like this, she felt panic beginning to set in as she started to fear she would be trapped in this fog for the rest of her life. No, I am not going out in such a stupid way. I can do this. There must be a correct path somewhere, or none of the other owls would continue with this farce. This is simply a test and I need to find the answer. Calming down and no longer flying around aimlessly, Evelyn emptied her mind and felt out her surroundings. When she did, she sensed it. There was actually a path created in the fog where there were areas with denser magical energy. It was faint and would not be easily detected, but as she focused, she could feel that there was definitely a difference. Following this path, she wound her way around the natural barriers that the thick jungle had provided and flew deeper and deeper into the fog. Eventually, as she followed this path, the fog started to become less dense, and soon she was able to see much further around her and came out into an opening in the jungle. In this opening she could see that there was a circle of trees surrounding a much larger one that sat in the middle. On each of these surrounding trees were a number of owls that were perched and staring towards the one in the center. Finding a place among these trees, Evelyn perched onto a large branch and looked out towards the central tree that had everyone else's attention. That was when she spotted the three entities within this central tree, two of which were powerful owls that she could tell were stronger than any she had ever seen. Yet the third one was something that made her begin to feel extreme fear, as she stared at the humanoid figure sitting within the tree. Chapter 42 Gathering of Owls, 2, you are listening at NovelFull.audio. Looking at this humanoid figure sitting within the large tree in the center of this clearing, Evelyn began to panic. Her thoughts immediately drifted to this being a trap set up by some humans to lure in a bunch of owls that they could capture. However, as she looked closer, she noticed that while this figure may have looked human, they were actually quite a bit different. The most noticeable difference was that on their back they had two large deep blue wings jutting out. Along with that, their ears were pointed outwards, and the irises of their eyes were yellow in color just as many owls had. Wait, is she an owl that has taken humanoid form? Seeing this, Evelyn could only believe that her conclusion was correct, as this woman who looked to be in her mid-20s was flanked on either side by the two powerful owls that also sat in the center tree. It was quite obvious from this positioning that she was the one in charge here, and Evelyn found it unlikely that this many owls would just sit around if an intruder who was not a part of their race had invaded. Also, as she stared intently, she could feel instinctually that they were most certainly an owl. She had found this out already, but other owls did not put her on edge as much as other beasts and humans. There was a certain kinship that they all shared, and while it certainly was not enough to keep them from fighting each other, it did give them a sense of camaraderie. Still, how did they do it? Is it some magic spell that transforms them? But why show that off here, when it would seem to have no purpose? Is it maybe some sort of evolution? Except I never read anything about this from the books Mason left me. Her mind moving at a mile a minute, Evelyn could not figure out how this was possible. Nothing she had learned since coming to this world would lead her to believe that beasts could somehow get humanoid forms. Yet there in front of her was the proof that it was possible, and it added on to the depths of this world she knew nothing about. However, her thoughts were soon interrupted as another owl landed right next to her. Looking up, she saw the same snowy owl that had helped her before and told her about this place. Almost immediately she wanted to shirk away, but held herself back from seeming openly rude. This owl had helped her, and while she did not know what its motives were, she had made it because of him and was willing to at least act cordial for now. The snowy owl, seeing that Evelyn was not going to fly away, began glowing with magical energy and extended a thin strand towards her to communicate as it had before. This time though it did not make the connection and waited for her approval to do so. Nodding her head, Evelyn gave her consent, since she had a lot of questions, and wanted to see if this snowy owl could answer them. I am glad to see that you made it here. I knew with your powers that even though you are not as advanced as everyone else you would be able to do it. Cocking her head to the side, Evelyn was not sure what wise snowy owl meant by this, until she took a good look around her, feeling numerous sets of eyes watching her. Of all the other owls here, she was the only one that was at the middle tier of the fiend beast rank. All of the others were above her, with most being peak fiend beasts, with only a few that were at the high tier. Then there were also around a dozen owls at the awakened rank, which were the ones that were truly a cut above the rest. This meant that Evelyn was the weakest of the bunch in terms of rank, which was she was receiving quite a bit of glances from the other owls. They wondered how she had made it this far, since all of the other mid-tier fiend beast owls had either been beaten down or were lost in the fog. Yes, it looks like I really am the only one at my level to make it here. Now allow me to give you my thanks for telling me about this place and directing me. I was a bit wary of you at first, but it seems that you are not entirely untrustworthy. Of course, as Evelyn said this, she lied as easily as she breathes, since she most certainly did not trust this owl in pretty much any capacity. To her, anyone that acted nice that was not a family member wanted something from her and would use her up until there was nothing left. In both her lives she had been tortured, and now she would rather isolate herself from getting close to anyone else than risk being hurt again. Still, she knew she could not make it on her own, which was why she had come here to join the owl's roost, and why she was still talking to this snowy owl. She wanted the information she could get from the other owls and figured she might as well start with this snowy owl. So how is it you and all of these other owls knew about this place? Evelyn asked. Oh, that is right, you ended up here by chance. For all of the others I am not exactly sure how they found out, but another owl who already has joined the roost told me about it. I had recently lost my home, so I figured that this would be a good opportunity to find a new one. A slightly sorrowful expression then came over his face as he mentioned his lost home, and for a moment Evelyn felt that she could relate to this guy. Yet she quickly shook her head to snap herself out of this. She was not here to try and get closer to anyone and wanted to keep to herself. Feeling sorry for someone that was in a similar situation to was not going to help her in any way. Mind if I ask what this trick is you are using to communicate? I have never seen anything like this before. Evelyn asked, the curiosity plain to see on her face. However, before the snowy owl could answer, one of the owls in the middle began glowing slightly, and dozens of tiny threads of magical energy shot out of them which connected with all of the owls here. Then through this connection, this owl said, "It is time for us to now begin." Chapter 43 Undeserved Ire. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Suddenly hearing a new voice in her head, Evelyn looked back towards the central tree and at the owl that had connected himself to all of the others. He looked quite a bit like a barn owl as far as she could tell, and was by far the largest owl here, being nearly 20 feet tall. Along with his size, his plumage was quite impressive as well, as he had a beautiful golden pattern flowing through his cream-white feathers. He is strong, Evelyn thought as she looked him over. There was no doubt in her mind that this owl was far stronger than any of the others that had gathered here except for his compatriots in the center tree. Even the awakened beast rank owls here looked pretty weak in comparison, and she wondered if he was possibly a tyrant beast. However, her train of thought was quickly put on hold as he began transmitting his thoughts to all of the other owls now that he had their attention. Seeing that all of you have made your way here, we assume that your goal is to join us at the owl's roost. However, if you are under the misunderstand that just making it here is qualification enough, you are wrong. We have no use for the weak in our ranks, and arriving at this place is just a preliminary. Only those who demonstrate strength and ingenuity in the upcoming trials shall be able to join us. Now some of you already show more promise than others and shall be allowed to join on the merit you have already have. After he said this, 13 of the owls that had arrived here received another message in their heads telling them that they were already qualified to join the owl's roost. Among these owls 12 of them were the ones that had already reached the awakened beast rank. Yet there was one owl who had caught the eyes of these examiner, even thought they were still at the peak of the fiend beast rank like most of the others. Now, the 13 of you shall follow me and I shall take you to your new home and get you inducted into our ranks. The barn owl with the golden pattern said. Naturally the 12 awakened beast excitedly and with their heads held up high in superiority flew towards the central tree and waited to be led to the owl's roost. Except one of the 13 that had already been accepted had not left his perch, and was instead looking down with a conflicted expression at the owls next to him. Looking up at the snowy owl, Evelyn wondered why he was looking at her with a sorrowful gaze. "You there. Hurry up and come on over. We do not have all day. You have already been chosen to enter the roost and do not have to take the trials." Hearing another message over the magical connection, the snowy owl heard the annoyance in the barn owl's tone. "I would like to request that I take the trials as well," he said while taking glances at Evelyn. Unfortunately for him, the owl who was one of this year's examiners was not in the happiest of moods, since he did not want to be here to start with. "No, you have already been chosen to join, so you can come with me now, or I will force you to leave. There is no point in having you undergo challenges you will likely beat, especially since your motives are quite clear." Having seen through what this snowy owl obviously wanted to do, there was even less reason to allow him to take the trials that most would have to in order to enter the owl's roost. Gritting his beak and closing his eyes, the snowy owl was full of frustration. He had figured that he would be able to help Evelyn out during the trials that weeded out the weakest owls, and that he would be able to look cool and get closer to her by doing so. But now that option was taken off the table, and he was left with entering now, or leaving with nothing. Eventually he made his decision and flew over to the other owls that had already been chosen. All of the other owls that had not been chosen looked down at him with jealousy, and his reluctance to have joined made them only angrier. Every other owl here would have killed to be in his position and get into the owl's roost without having to risk their lives, yet this snowy owl looked reluctant to go. As if he had not been chosen to go to the paradise of the owls, but instead to some sort of horrible torture chamber. This made all of the other owls want to tear him apart for being so appreciative of the gift he had received. Though while a number of them were focused on him, plenty others were looking at Evelyn, who he had been sitting next to. It was clear to them why he did not want to leave, and that was because they perceived that Evelyn was his sweetheart. Of course, that could not be further from the truth, but for every other owl here that was what it looked like to them. Sadly for Evelyn, that meant that a good deal of the envy and ire that was being projected at the snowy owl was being redirected towards her simply for having associated with him. Feeling the hostility directed at her, she looked around and saw that around 24 owls were staring at her with malice in their eyes. For a second she wondered why this was, but quickly came to the understand. Groaning she thought, "This is why I did not want to interact with anyone. Now things are only going to be harder for me." Seeing that a number of the other owls had it out for her, she knew that they were likely to target her if they got the opportunity. Chapter 44 The first trial begins. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. As the 13 chosen owls who already met the qualifications to enter the owl's roost began leaving, the snowy owl took one last glance at Evelyn before flying off into the fog. Now all of the remaining owls were left with the remaining 2 examiners, one of which was the humanoid owl. Though she seemed wholly disinterested in the current developments, and it was the other one that moved forward and addressed the hundreds of owls that remained. This owl, in contrast to the other one that had just gone away, had pitch-black feathers that made her difficult to see in the dark fog. "All of you left here have not yet met the minimum qualifications to enter our sanctuary. But do not worry, you will all have your chance to prove your worth. We have prepared a number of trials to test your speed, power, ingenuity, and luck. Those that pass shall be granted the right to join us at the owl's roost. For those of you that fall short, the most likely outcome is to be crippled or die." Hearing this, many of the owls began to become hesitant. Most of them had not known that there were going to be a series of trials beforehand and thought just making it here would be enough to grant them entry. Now I can see that some of you are beginning to worry, as you should. These trials will not be easy, and I doubt that 10% of you here will pass. If you wish to back out, now is the time, since you will not get the chance once we begin. Nothing will be held against you if you wish to preserve your own life. The black-feathered owl said. She wanted all of them to know just how dangerous it was, and to persuade those that were not resolved to die to leave. Almost immediately around 20% of the more than 200 owls turned around and left. They had persevered hard in order to reach the level they were at and did not wish to die now. Also, they had seen that all of the owls that had reached the awakened rank had been accepted. So, if they took another couple of decades to get stronger, they might be able to pierce the ceiling that most beasts got stuck at, and gain entry with no struggle at all. Of course, many of these owls here had come to join the Owl's Roost because they had found no way to advance further on their own after being stuck at the peak of the friend beast rank for dozens of years. As for Evelyn, she had already chosen to come here, and figured that there were going to be some sort of tests from the start. Though she did think about turning around and fleeing for a bit. On account of the hostility she had gained for simply having interacted with the snowy owl. Still, most of those that had been emitting malice towards her were the cowards that were leaving, and she figured one way or another she was going to have to deal with them. It will be better just to take these trials. I could spend years twiddling my wings around out in the wilds without making any progress. I was already beginning to stagnate, which is why I came here to begin with. Stealing her resolve and ambition. Evelyn kept to her decision to join this society of owls and milk out whatever secrets and resources she could from them. She had already come to terms with the fact that she might die, but she would rather lose her life in the pursuit of her goals than cower away until she died. After 8 minutes the last of the owls that had decided to not risk their lives had left. Leaving only around 120 of them left to take the trials. Well, it looks like all of you have made your decision. I can see that you all have guts, but that will only get you so far. I am going to weed out which of you actually have the talent and skill necessary to continue on. Those of you that are weak are going to fall, and it will be very quickly. As the black-feathered owl said the word weak, she definitely was staring at Evelyn. Being the lowest-ranking owl here, naturally she would be seen as the weakest and likely to be the first to go. Not to mention that there were a number of other owls that had decided to target her during these trials simply because of their envy towards the snowy owl that she had been talking to. None of them could understand why he had been chosen, when all of them had been left behind to prove themselves with their lives on the line. However, he had been chosen from out of all the other peak fiend beasts for 2 reasons. The first was that the examiners had seen him using his technique to speak with Evelyn, which was an advanced ability they would not expect to see from a fiend beast. Or even most awakened beasts for that matter. The second reason was that they could tell that he had a dual affinity and that while one of them was water, the other was a much rarer one. This had given him the qualifications in their eyes for him to be permitted to enter the Owl's Roost above the other fiend beasts that had gathered in droves. All of you prepare yourselves. Your first trail is about to begin. Now all you need to do is follow me. The instant after the black-feathered owl said this, she took off from the central tree and began flying straight upwards. As this happened, many of the owls were stunned and did not react immediately as their minds processed what was going on. Yet one owl took off immediately, and that was Evelyn. Her mind was more advanced than any of the other challengers remaining, who had on average the intelligence of a 7 or 8-year-old. Quickly she flew up right behind the examiner, who began disappearing into the thick fog that permeated the area. Within only a few more moments panic began to set in among the other owls and they took off as well, trying to catch up to the examiner who was moving away. Soon all of the owls that had gathered in this clearing were gone save for one. The humanoid owl was still lounging around in the center tree and had glanced up where the other owls had gone with little interest. I wonder if there will actually be anyone exceptional this year. Chapter 45 A Show of Power. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Evelyn flapped her wings swiftly to keep up with the black-feathered owl who was administering the trials necessary to earn the qualifications to enter the Owl's Roost. She had shot off without warning, and while it was a considerably slow speed for an owl like her that was at the peak of the awakened beast rank, Evelyn was already flying at nearly the highest speed she could keep up continuously. Too much faster, and she would have to start expending her magical energy to lower her gravity and shoot out bursts of wind to keep up, and this was not what she wanted. She was certain that just following behind this black feathered owl was going to be the easiest part of this trial, and that she was going to need to conserve her magical energy for later. Luckily, she did not speed up just yet, and once she had reached the canopy of the forest she leveled out and began flying straight through the jungle. Hot on her tail feathers, Evelyn made sure to stay as close as she could, in order to not lose the examiner, and to keep the other owls that were catching up from having an easy time attacking her. One wrong move and their attack might hit the black feathered owl, and that was likely to cost them their lives. Continuing to fly through the jungle, the examiner slowly began to speed up as she went, and deftly moved through the trees, making it difficult to follow her. Along with this, the dense fog still permeated the entire area, making visibility even for these owls to only be a few hundred feet at best. Still, Evelyn did her best to keep up, but as the examiner passed around one of the trees, an opening presented itself for one of the owls that had decided to direct his malice of the snowy owl at Evelyn. A bolt of fire shot out of his head and right towards Evelyn as she was going to round the tree the examiner had just passed by. However, as she sensed the incoming threat, she had to pull her body up and sent a gust of wind in front of her which reversed her momentum. The bolt of fire flew right in front of her, and she could feel the heat coming off from it. Clicking her tongue, she had hoped that none of the other owls would target her, since they really needed to keep their focus on the black feathered owl who was leading the way. But this owl with orange and red plumage was not worried in the slightest about catching up if he fell a little behind, and figured that Evelyn would be easy to deal with quickly. After all, he was a peak fiend beast that had grown his power in a near-perfect environment. As his family, unlike Evelyn's, was still alive and quite powerful. He had been given all of the best resources since he was young, and his parents were even awakened beasts that had once been a part of the owl's roost themselves until they had left to raise their family. Spinning his body around, flames began to bust out of him and 6 large streaks of fire shot off towards Evelyn. Seeing this, she was very surprised, as this attack was by far the most complicated one she had seen any beast unleash. Even her parents' magic had not looked this clean and precise, and the only thing she had seen that was superior was the magic used by the human that had beaten her parents. But as powerful and controlled as this owl's magic was, it made little difference to Evelyn. The 6 streaks of fire hit her and exploded on impact, creating a large blast of flames that engulfed the area. His face full of surprise, the owl that had attacked Evelyn thought that she would at least try to dodge and ultimately fail, but instead she had just continued hovering there and took all 6 streaks of fire. Quickly, though, a smirk replaced his surprise, as he figured that this poor dumb mid-tier fiend beast had simply been too weak and slow to even try to avoid his attack. Yet as he flew by the area that was still covered in smoke and smoldering fire, his body suddenly lurched downwards, as it became nearly 4 times heavily. Then, flying out of the flames with her talons aimed in front of her, was Evelyn. There was not a single scratch on her from being swallowed by flames, and she flew forward like a missile. She had sent herself forward with a powerful gust of wind and was increasing her own gravity, making the force behind her attack much stronger as she fell down on the owl that had just attacked her. Her talons pierced right through his dense feathers and slid deep in his flesh as she landed on top of him. Naturally, he was astonished to see this happen for a number of reasons. The first of which was that Evelyn was still alive. Even a mid-tier awakened beast should not have been able to come out from that attack unscathed if they took it head-on like that, and a beast at Evelyn's level should have left nothing but charred remains. However, she was not even injured and had countered attack with more power than a mid-tier fiend beast should have been able to. It was practically inconceivable for her talons to have sliced through the feathers and flesh of this orange and red owl so seamlessly. His defensive abilities should have protected him, and Evelyn's attack should have only left a shallow flesh wound at best. Yet they sunk in deep and had even pierced one of the orange and red feathered owl's lungs. He began coughing up blood and felt a searing pain in his body where Evelyn had jammed her talons in. Unfortunately for this owl that Evelyn had just dealt a devastating blow to, she was not done yet. She quickly removed one of her claws as the two of them plummeted and jammed it into her adversary's chest. Stabbing into his heart, she felt a burst of warm blood on her foot and a dark smile appeared on her face. Pushing off from the now dead owl that had attacked her, she released her increased gravity and stared down at her defeated foe as he plummeted to the forest floor below. She then looked up at the other owls, many of whom had slowed down, or even stopped in shock seeing what had happened. Maybe this will teach them not to mess with me, Evelyn thought. She had just easily dispatched an owl at the peak of the fiend beast rank, and this showed to all of the others that she was not to be taken lightly. Of course, she had won due to her overwhelming advantage of the common element of fire and a very well-timed sneak attack, but that did not make it any less impressive in the eyes of those who had witnessed her feat. Still, no one stuck around too long, as the examiner had not slowed down at all during this scuffle and was flying away. I really wish I could get his beast core, but I need to prioritize this trial. Giving herself a quick boost with a gust of wind, Evelyn took back off towards the examiner in order to reclaim her spot in the lead. Chapter 46 The Wicked Webs of the Jungle. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. After having dispatched one of the owls that was targeting her, Evelyn hurriedly caught back up to the examiner and the main group of owls that were following behind her. However, the demeanor of all of these owls had taken a shift, as they now looked at Evelyn cautiously. She had quite easily dispatched a beast 2 minor ranks above her, and there was not a scratch on her from the experience. Many of them had seen her engulfed in fire, yet she had come out of it like it had not been real but only an illusion. They were all now quite wary of her, and none of them wanted to be the first to approach her again. At least, not during this trial. Taking time to attack a fellow trial goer would only lead to them possibly losing the examiner, or maybe even getting killed. No, for now all of the other owls were acting civil in order to get past their current goal of getting through this trial. For those few who still wished to, it was likely that they would have a later chance to vent their frustration. Quickly Evelyn made it back to her position at the front of the flock, only trailing behind the black feathered owl who was leading the way. She had to expend a bit of her magical energy to do so, but she definitely felt more comfortable being right behind the examiner. Over an hour went by as all of the owls followed after the examiner, and to this point only one owl had died during this supposedly harrowing trial, and that was the one Evelyn had killed. Yet as many of the owls were beginning to lull into a sort of relaxation as they figured this trial was just a test of endurance, they were proved to be terribly wrong. In this fog it was difficult to see, but Evelyn noticed the examiner fly out of the way of seemingly nothing. Looking closely, she saw a thin thread that was connected between two trees and doing as the examiner had she flew around it. But as they moved deeper into this area, she began to notice more and more threads, some of which were connected together in a large net-like shape. Her eyes going wide, Evelyn realized that they were now in the territory of what must have been some very large spiders. Though while she realized this, unfortunately for some of the other owls, they had gotten too complacent. Within just a minute of noticing that first web, Evelyn, who was keeping an eye on her surroundings, heard the distressed screeching of another owl. This large owl that was 8 feet tall and had entirely blue feathers had gotten himself caught in the webs as he had not been paying attention. Thrashing about, the blue-feathered owl tried to break free as he shot out blasts of water, which was his elemental affinity. Unfortunately, it was a poor match against these threads that were very sturdy and each as strong as a steel cord. Its physically strength also proved to be of no help, and only made matters worse as he became more entangled in the webs. Except being caught in this web was the least of this owl's worries, as the creature who had spun it descended down from the trees slowly and quietly from behind. Then when it was right behind this owl, the large spider that was the stuff of nightmares, sunk its fangs into the struggling owl and began wrapping it up in its web. When it had finished this, it dragged the now paralyzed owl higher up into the tree where this spider's lair was. Many of the owls witnessed this happen and began flying around much more carefully to avoid these death traps. However, this first owl being captured set off a chain reaction through this part of the forest, and the hundreds of spiders that made it their home began descending from the trees. These beasts were not only trappers with their webs, but also proactive hunters. And when so much prey presented themselves to them, they were not going to pass up the opportunity. What the hell is that thing? Evelyn thought as she saw one of these spiders for the first time. Naturally, she had already suspected that this kind of beast were responsible for these webs, and she had heard the unfortunate end of that blue-feathered owl, but this was the first time seeing these nightmare fuel spiders. Not only were they 10 feet long from head to end, but they also had long spindly legs that looked sharp like blades, and a dark green patterning on their mostly black bodies that allowed them to blend in better with the jungle. Yet the worst part definitely had to be their head, which had 8 piercing eyes that made Evelyn shiver, and 2 long fangs that looked like curved daggers with venom dripping down them. Turning to the side, she barely was able to avoid the web being shot at her as she was incredibly distracted by these spiders' perturbing appearance. But her troubles were far from over, as this spider that had dropped down and was targeting her leapt from the web it was dangling on right towards her. Seeing this, she was surprised, as they were currently hundreds of feet above the ground, but this thing showed no regard for its safety and single-mindedly jumped at her. Still, while its reckless move might have worked on some, it was going to be wholly ineffective on Evelyn. She simply created a large gust of wind that batted the mid-tier fiend beast rank spider away and continued after the examiner, who had not slowed down at all. Of course, she was being attacked as well, since these spiders were practically mindless creatures, not having gained any greater intelligence than what a normal spider might have, even as they had reached a higher rank. Though in turn they had gained more ferocity and were a social group of spiders that could work together to some degree. Nevertheless, the attack of these spiders were child's play for the examiner to deal with, and any webs or spiders that got close to her seemed to bounce off an inviolable wall. In fact, now she was not even attempting to dodge the webs, having only done so at the beginning to give a slight warning to the owls behind her, even if only a few had noticed. Swiftly the number of owls that were able to keep up dwindled drastically as they were caught in the spiders' already laid web traps, or were hit by the constant barrage of webs being shot at them from these spiders. Cries of distress resounded through the area, and within just a few minutes those that were still keeping up with the first trial had dwindled to just a bit over 70. Chapter 47 The Queen Spider's Targets. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Damn it! Get away from me! Unleashing as large a gust as she could, Evelyn blew back 4 of the large jungle spiders that had jumped at her along with 2 shots of thread that aimed to entangle her. As they moved deeper into the spiders' territory, their attack became far more frequent and coordinated as the prey dwindled down. Now even some at the peak of the fiend beast rank were attacking Evelyn, and if not for her ability to lower gravity she certainly would have been overwhelmed. By making these hefty spiders around a fourth as heavy as what they normally would be, she was able to blow them away with her wind magic, but otherwise it certainly would not be enough. Along with these increased and more ferocious attacks, she was getting farther and farther behind the examiner, who showed no signs of slowing down as she just barreled through without any issue. As for the other owls, they had started making teams to keep each other safe, but Evelyn had found they did not want her around. Either because of her low rank, or the fact that they had a degree of malice towards her for their assumed connection she had to the snowy owl. Still, she kept at it and let her rage drive her forward as she used her wind and gravity manipulation to keep up. Screw these stupid spiders. I swear when I learn how to control my heavenly flame I am coming back here and burning them all down to the ground. Spinning out of the way of another spider, Evelyn was beginning to get tired of this and wondered how much longer they would be in their territory. This was only the first trial and the examiner had nearly culled half of the original participants, who were currently being chowed down on by the hundreds of spiders in this area. Yet a glimmer of light shone through after around another 2 minutes of struggling, when she saw that the webs that had been spread all over the trees in this area began to lessen. She figured that they would be exiting the spider's home soon, and hopefully be done with this first trial. Unfortunately, with Evelyn was lagging behind now, only ahead of one group of owls that was made up of the majority of the high-tier fiends beast owls that were left, a large form descended from the trees to block their path. Stopping abruptly, she only just barely avoided being caught as this huge form lashed out with one of its legs that had a ball of webbing on it. This ball of webbing then flew off past her and hit one of the other owls and exploded. It was like this spider had just launched a web grenade, and with one quick move it pulled in the owl it had caught. Unfortunately, while she had dodged its first attack, this huge 16-foot-long spider had no intention of letting the straggling owls get by and positioned its body between them and the exit. An awakened beast. Looking at this spider, there was no doubt in Evelyn's mind that it was a beast that had evolved beyond the fine beast rank and was a low-tier awakened beast. It exuded a powerful aura similar to the other awakened beast she had seen, and she could instinctively tell it was beyond her. And along with its much larger size, this spider had a far more pronounced green pattern over its black body, and a number of spiky protrusions on its head that looked like a crown. Venom dripped down its long fangs, and as Evelyn stared at it, she thought that it almost seemed to be smiling. In a flash this spider queen aimed its abdomen forward, and a large web shot out over a wide range of area. Going into a nosedive, Evelyn dove towards the ground, sending out a gust of wind behind her to accelerate faster. But she quickly saw that she was not going to be fast enough to escape this way and changed her strategy. Her mind racing, she examined the web falling towards her looking for the largest opening. It was like time slowed down for her as she did this, and within less than a second, she found her escape route. Flying towards this opening, she tucked her wings in and sucked in her gut to make herself as small as possible. Just barely she slipped through this hole in the webbing and came out the other side without being caught. Her smaller relative size to the other owls had finally come in handy here, as none of the other owls could have ever hoped to make it through the opening as Evelyn had. Nevertheless, all but 3 of the other owls were now caught in this web and secured as food. While Evelyn and the others were still trapped in between the Spider Queen and her minions. Moving forward, they would somehow have to get around the giant spider in their way that was at a realm far above them, and behind them the horde of its minions lying in wait. The other 3 owls though all opted to take their chances on the weaker spiders they had already gotten by. And flew back the way they came. Deciding to try and preserve their lives over passing this trial. Except just as Evelyn expected, they were caught and injected with venom almost immediately. The only reason they had made it this far was because of the spiders had split their attention on the other trial-going owls. Now that they only had the 3 targets, there was no way they could avoid the assault of hundreds of spiders. It is waiting to see what I do, Evelyn thought as she hovered in the air and stared down the queen spider. She could see that it was enjoying this hunt, and that it wanted her to make the next move so that it could crush her attempt at escape. The only path for me is forward. I am going to push through even if it kills me. Chapter 48. If being smart won't work, then it's time to be reckless. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Faced with a near insurmountable predicament, Evelyn's mind was racing to find a way out. Currently she was face to face with an awakened beast that definitely wanted to capture and then subsequently eat her, in what she could only imagine would be a torture on par if not worse than her previous death. She knew that spiders would often inject their venom into their prey and leave them paralyzed for quite some time before eating them alive. And judging by how many owls this large queen spider had captured, there was a good chance she could end up in its pantry for a while, suffering in agony. How the hell do I get around it? Its body is huge, and it can shoot out webs that will likely get me if I am not fully on guard, and even then, I could easily get caught. I guess I could charge it and up the gravity and hope that is enough to rip it off the web it is dangling from, but I doubt that will work. For nearly half a minute Evelyn continued staring down this queen spider while trying to come up with any feasible method to get by it. Unfortunately, while the queen spider had been patiently waiting to catch Evelyn as she made her move, it was starting to get antsy and was preparing to make a move of its own by firing out a large web she had no chance of escaping from. Seeing this, Evelyn realized her time was up, but as she was panicking, she had an idea. Doviko, she knew that spiders could easily navigate their own webs and rarely got stuck in them, but this queen spider was preparing an especially large net that was incredibly sticky. With its wide area, it was likely that if she got caught up in it instead, Evelyn would hopefully get at least a few seconds where it was distracted and could fly on by. It is already probably too late to catch up to the examiner, but if I can get by, I should at least be able to live. With a rough plan in her mind, Evelyn shot towards the queen spider flying up above her. There was very little room in this situation as she was dangling down from the treetops, but she was going to need the height advantage for her plan to work. Of course, there was always a risk that the queen spider might decide to physically lunge at her, in which case she was probably screwed, but taking this gamble was all she could come up with. Luckily her bet seemed to work out as the queen spider launched a wide-range net at her that there was 0% chance she could escape from. But this was exactly what Evelyn had wanted, and since she had escaped the last web net by slipping through one of its gaps last time, the queen spider had woven it even tighter together this time. However, this only helped as it gave the web more surface area, and as Evelyn lowered gravity to lighten the webs and sent out a strong and wide gust of wind as she could, which bounced the web back towards the queen spider. And the second its momentum changed, she switched her gravity control to increase it and the web barreled back down at the queen spider. In an instant Evelyn had reversed the situation and had caught the spider in its own web, allowing her to fly by as it began trying to shake the web off. Smiling, she thought she had made it out home free. There were no other spiders in her way now, and even as fast and agile as the spiders were, they would never be able to keep up with her full flying speed. Though as she was about to exit the edge of the spider's territory, something completely unexpected happened. The tree began to move on their own and she was hit hard by a branch. Except this branch did not send Evelyn flying, but instead was covered in a very sticky webbing that entangled her and put a stop to her apparent escape. Her reversal on the spider had been turned around again in one move she had never considered. Yet as she thought about it, she now understood that this must have been the queen spider's magical affinity. She had not seen any of the other spiders use magic, so she had forgotten to account that they should be able to. In fact, all of the spiders here had an affinity for nature magic, though the queen was the only capable of actually doing much. Their normal abilities were already so strong they had little reason to use their relatively weaker magic, but Evelyn had been completely caught off guard by this. Now she was stuck in a web that had her tightly bound, and she could see the queen spider expertly pull off the last of her webbing that Evelyn had knocked back at her. It had only taken a few seconds for the expert weaver to get out of its best netting, and now it was slowly approaching Evelyn to allow her a chance to feel more fear. No, 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 struggling to break free, Evelyn, like every other owl, just found herself being entangled further, and soon she could not move at all. She tried increasing gravity, but this only caused the branch to droop a bit and it and the webs held strong. Damn it all! I cannot die here like this. I did not want to do this since it might kill me, but if being smart won't work, it's time to be reckless. With her well thought out and executed plan not having worked, now Evelyn was left with one reckless plan that she thought was likely to fail. Still, she would rather go out in a huge explosion than be eaten by a giant spider. Closing her eyes, she focused on her beast and mana cores, and sent all of the magical energy she had left towards the crimson heavenly flame and began growing its power within her. She had so far refrained from using it as her control over it was abysmal, and it could easily set the jungle on fire, which she doubted the examiner was going to appreciate. Nevertheless, it was do or die time, and if it gave her a 1% chance of survival, she was willing to set herself and the jungle ablaze. Yet as she stoked the flames with her all for the first time, something abnormal happened. Every other time she had used its power she had been afraid of what it might do, but this time she let it go unbound and without any fear. In fact, all her hopes were thrown upon it, and it began to resonate with her feelings. It quickly wrapped around her mana core and began infusing its power into it, growing in power as it dyed her human mana core. Then it happened, Evelyn let out all she had, and her body burst into crimson flames. Normally this would have looked like a suicide attack, as she was engulfed in flames, yet an eerie calm surrounded Evelyn as she was engulfed by her heavenly flames. Just now she had made the power her own, and it had accepted her in her moment of desperation. The webs around her soon burned away and she was once again free from her binding. Cautiously the queen spider jumped back as Evelyn burst into flames, as fire was her greatest weakness. It is time to end this. Opening her eyes, they were now glowing crimson just as her body was, and she shot forward towards the queen spider. Right now she felt invincible, and her goal shifted from escape to attack. Letting out a defiant screech, the queen spider shot more webs at Evelyn, but they burned to ash before they could even touch her. Currently she was the embodiment of all these spiders' greatest weakness, and their natural abilities were useless against her. Still, the queen spider was not done yet. She began glowing and the jungle started shifting as she exerted her control of it. Dozens of branches began closing in around Evelyn and their leaves striped away as they began sharp as spears. Spinning around and moving better than she ever had, she dodged out of the way, weaving through the branches and burning away those that close to her. Then when she was 20 feet away from the queen spider who was frantically doing all she could to keep Evelyn away, she spun her body around and sent out a twister of crimson fire that was carried by her wind. In a frantic effort to protect herself, the queen spider pulled the trees around in front of her to block the fire twister coming for her. Boom! As the crimson heavenly fire hit the trees, it created a huge explosion that rocked this area of the jungle. Even the fog that permeated the area was blown back and vaporized, leaving a completely open space that was clear for the first time since Evelyn had entered the fog. A number of trees had now caught fire and the other spiders had fled the area in fear of their natural weakness. However, as the smoke began to settle, Evelyn looked out and saw that the queen spider was still alive. But while she was alive, she had not gotten out unscathed. Half of her body was horribly burned, and she was missing 3 of her legs on her right side, along 4 of her eyes having exploded as the water in them had been rapidly heated. Staring her down, Evelyn, who was still covered in crimson flames, stood her ground as if daring the queen spider to continue attacking. Luckily her bluff worked and the ruler of this part of the forest scurried away to heal her wounds. Letting out a sigh of relief, she stopped supplying the heavenly flame with magical energy and it quickly died down. She had used everything she had in that last attack, and just keeping those few flames around her body had been all she could do as a means of deception. Had the queen spider attacked her again, there was no doubt she would not be able to offer any resistance. Unfortunately, even though she had somehow beaten back the threat of the spiders, she was now left with a new problem. She had no idea which way the examiner had gone, and she was lost in middle of the jungle. I guess I will just have to pick a random direction and hope I get lucky. However, as she was about to flying in the direction she had chosen, something happened within the fog. Parts of it began to coalesce and started glowing in small sphere that seemed to be leading her down a certain path. Chapter 49 Respite before the second trial. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Looking at the glowing balls of fog that has just formed in front of her, Evelyn was immediately wary. She was currently breathing heavily, practically out of magical energy and stamina. Having only enough energy to hover and fly slowly. And now all of a sudden something she had not seen before was happening, and her first thoughts were that it was some kind of trap. Though as she thought about it, would a trap really be necessary in this situation, as she was already in such a shape that probably a newly evolved fiend beast could beat her. Also, this fog had been incredibly resistant to any magic she had used on it, and only her all-out attack with her heavenly flame had really any effect on it. What if the examiner left this here in case any of us somehow made it past that queen spider? If they are looking for talent, then it would make sense to maybe leave a way for anyone lucky or skilled enough to get by to continue the trial. Trying to convince herself of this, Evelyn really wanted to hope that this might be a means for her to continue the trial to get into the Owl's Roost. This world was still very unfamiliar and dangerous, and while she was not thrilled to be associating with anyone, she knew it was necessary to advance herself in this world. I was just going to go in a random direction before. If it turns out to be a trap, then I guess I was just an idiot once again and deserve to die. Deciding to follow the path of glowing fog, Evelyn continued on flapping her wings as best she could in order to try and catch up to the examiner and the other owls. However, as Evelyn left, a figure who had been hidden in a dense layer of fog smiled seeing her go down the path that they had laid out. It would be a shame to let an owl as talented as her fail after she fought off that queen spider who was almost an entire rank above her. That flame was also not something normal. It would be unfortunate if I was not able to study it further. Now, I wonder if she will be able to pass the other trials as brilliantly as this one. Oh, but first I need to contact Eldana and tell her to delay the second trial a bit so that she can catch up. Flying through the fog and easily overtaking Evelyn, the administrator of this exam and the humanoid owl that had been sitting in the central tree along with the two examiners hastily caught up to the examiner and relayed her orders to slow down. Following the path of floating and glowing fog orbs, Evelyn continued on through the jungle which was now quiet. It was almost unsettling how still it was as she had gotten accustomed to being attacked from all sides and keeping her guard up. Yet for all her apprehension, nothing came out at her and the path remained quiet and peaceful until she saw a break in the fog. A circular clearing had been made amongst a group of trees, and in it she could see that the remaining owls as well as the examiner were sitting in the trees. It was at this point that Evelyn's assumptions that someone was controlling the fog were pretty much confirmed to her. There was no way that a perfectly round area like this in the middle of it would have cleared out naturally, not to mention that these mows of floating fog lights had guided her here. I am definitely being watched by someone and they saw my fight against the queen spider and decided that to lead me to this place even though normally I would have already failed. Realizing this, Evelyn wished she had not had to resort to using the heavenly fire so brazenly, since from what Mason had written it was a priceless treasure that anyone would want to get their hands on. If a much stronger owl realized what she had in her possession, they might kill her to try and claim it. Still, she could not back and change the past, and without her heavenly flame's power she certainly would have died. Shaking her head and pushing her worries away, she flew into the clearing much to the surprise of the other trial-goers. Certainly, they had never thought she would survive an ambush from an awakened beast. The difference in power between them should have been so great that she should have died without putting up any resistance, but here she was now. It was an irrefutable fact that she had somehow made it here. And the others trial-goers could only guess she got supremely lucky and slipped away while the other owls were being slaughtered. Some of them even wanted to protest that she had already failed since she had not been able to keep up with the examiner, but that option was quickly taken away as they all heard her speaking in their heads. It appears that we have a bit of a straggler, but seeing as how you made it here before the second trial has begun, I will still consider you to have passed. We are testing your luck as well as other important attributes. With that, any hope of the other owls to get Evelyn disqualified was dashed away, and they could only accept that she would be continuing. Now as I sped here a bit quicker than anticipated, the second trial is not quite ready for us yet. Therefore, all of you shall have 1 hour to rest until it is time to begin your second trial. Do with your time as you wish. The examiner said. A number of the owls were surprised to hear this since they had not expected such a long break in between what were supposed to be arduous trials. And normally they would have been right. However, the administrator of this examination had taken an interest in Evelyn and had ordered that she be given a bit of time to recover. I truly do not understand her sometimes. But whenever something piques her interest, she goes to whatever length to satiate her curiosity. The blue feather examiner thought as she shook her head and pictured the exam's administrator. Chapter 50 Hunting and Gathering. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Evelyn let out a sigh of relief at somehow miraculously passing the first trial. It had been truly difficult for her to get this far, and without her sudden burst of control over the heavenly flames she certainly would have died. Well, I have an hour to relax and recover my stamina and magical energy. I had best do what I can to rest. Given a reprieve she honestly did not think she would receive, Evelyn could only rejoice as she closed her eyes and went to sleep. She needed all the rest she could get right now, and if she could get an hour nap, she was going to take it. Quickly her hour of sleep went by, and she was abruptly awakened by another message being spoken directly into her head. It is time for us to begin the second trial. For this trial each of you will be given a bag to collect items in, and to start will be given one beast core of a high-tier fiend beast. Throughout this area of the jungle a number of cores and magical plants have been left in various locations. Your goal is to collect 10 such items and return here with them. The examiner then paused for a moment to let this information sink in, and many owls cocked their heads in confusion. Honestly, this trial sounded way too easy, incredibly so in comparison to the last one. But of course, the examiner had only explained the basic premise of the next trail, and a devious smile came over her face as she gave out the finer details. Oh, but in addition to any treasures that we have left, there are still other beast and naturally growing magical plants around. If you can harvest the plants or kill the beast and take their cores, those will be accepted as well. Though only cores of high-tier fiend beasts or greater shall qualify, as well as magical plants of a certain quality. Oh, and there may or may not be enough for everyone here to pass. But if you have trouble finding items, you are free to steal them from your fellow competitors. However, you are not allowed to kill any other owls in this trial. Doing so will have you disqualified. After finishing her explanation, the examiner sat there for a moment, and then, to everyone's surprise, the fog that had been ever present began to withdraw completely around the area. Soon it had spread out for 3 miles in every direction, with where they currently were being the center. Once this miraculous phenomenon was over, the examiner handed out bags and a single beast core to everyone. Now all of you have 2 hours. Go out and collect the 10 items you need and be back here before time runs out. Anyone who has not made it back here by then will not pass, even if they have the necessary items. With that last direction, all of the owls frantically went flying into the jungle in search of beast cores and magical plants. However, some of the more aggressive owls began attacking their fellow trial goers right from the start, and 3 such owls had decided to make Evelyn their targets. Though while they were all targeting her as the perceived weakest owl here and easy prey, they were not exactly working together. Quickly 2 of them began squabbling amongst each other, leaving only one of them to truly go after Evelyn. Naturally, she had suspected she would be targeted, though it being this early was a bit of a surprise. Still, after going head-to-head against the queen spider, even an owl at the peak of the fiend beast rank really did not seem all that threatening to her now. Flying behind a tree, Evelyn avoided the wind blade that the owl chasing her fired off, and as she passed by, she lowered her gravity as much as she could and jammed her talons into the tree to abruptly stop her momentum. So, he can use wind blades like my mother and father could. Still, I can tell he is not quite as good as them, Evelyn observed. Of course, she had not even figured out how to focus her own wind magic to the point of making wind blades, but she still gave her internal criticism all the same. When the owl chasing her rounded the tree thinking that he would find Evelyn still flying away, he was completely blindsided as she jumped off of the tree and slammed into him. It was like he had suddenly been hit by a large rock, as Evelyn seemed much denser than she should have been. Along with that, this owl suddenly felt himself becoming heavier, and her plummeted to the ground with Evelyn on top of him. Unfortunately, for him, under her nearly 4 times gravity, Evelyn weighed more than 200 pounds, and his own increased weight made him more than 300. Quickly they reached the jungle's floor, and he was completely unable to get his bearings with Evelyn on top of him. Yet right before they impacted, she suddenly became very light, and with one flap of her wings and firing a heavy gust of wind below her, she shot back up into the air. Sadly, the owl that had antagonized her was too close to the jungle floor to recover and was pushed into the ground with an immense amount of force. A sickening cracking sound could be heard as he hit, and there was no doubt he had broken something. Nevertheless, he was still alive, as it was against the rules to kill him, so Evelyn simply left him in really bad shape where he may never fly again without some type of magical treatment. And I will be taking this. Rifling through his bag, she pulled out the beast core that he had been given like all of them and placed it into her own bag on her back. Now I wonder how those other 2 boozes are doing. Taking back off to where the other two owls that had targeted her were fighting, she saw that they were still battling it out, though both were noticeably wounded. Well, you reap what you sow, I will be taking your beast cores as well.